Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello and welcome to the Power Trends podcast. I am Kevin Lenahan, the New York Independent System Operator. Today we are speaking with Dan Zarrilli, who's with Columbia Climate School. Dan has a distinguished background with climate policy. His current role is Special Advisor for Climate and Sustainability at Columbia University, where he supports the world-leading climate school and advises on pathways to achieve the university's deep decarbonization goals. He joined Columbia from the New York City Mayor's office, where he served most recently in the role of Chief Climate Policy Advisor. He served New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Mayor Bill de Blasio over about 8 years. Under his leadership, in 2019, New York City released its long-term strategic plan, One NYC 2050, which included bold new actions to confront climate crisis. He also served on NOAA's advisory committee for the Sustained National Climate Assessment, FEMA's National Advisory Council, and he's currently an author on the 5th National Climate Assessment. Dan also serves on our Environmental Advisory Committee, and for those that may not be familiar, the EAC is a longstanding group of outside policy experts, academics, and researchers provide really important perspectives to the NYISO on how our markets and our planning processes can better support policy goals. Dan, we are thrilled to have you with us today. So obviously, well-versed in all things climate change and how we're going to address our decarbonization of the electric industry.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Kevin. Thanks for having me on today.
So let's dig right into what you're tackling. I'm imagining there's a number of different opportunities you have when you finally leave city government serving Mayor de Blasio. How did you get to Columbia? And then if you can summarize for us what it is that you're tackling now.
Yeah, sure. Columbia is a really special place, and it wasn't a hard choice to join here. We've got over 1,000 researchers working on climate change. It's literally the place where the term global warming was coined back in the 70s. Some of the really important testimony that put climate change on the front page with testimony in front of Congress in the late 80s by Jim Hansen. There's just such a legacy of, one, both understanding the problem, but also pushing forward solutions to the challenges we face from climate change. And now with the creation of the world's first climate school, what we're really trying to do is raise the bar on how we can inspire, educate, and empower the next generation of climate leaders here at Columbia. It was powerful for me to be able to take the experience and the work in government and to bring that to students. We do K through 12 programs, undergraduate, master's programs, executive education. And there's a driving theory, I think, that is behind what we're trying to do here, which is climate change is not just an offshoot of environmental studies or some like a niche environmental topic. It really touches all of society. And so the work that the climate school is doing is also done in partnership with all the other schools here at Columbia, because if you're getting a business degree, if you're getting a law degree, architecture, engineering, there's a climate angle to all of that. And so we're really trying to make sure that everybody has the right level of climate smarts as they face this new future that we're all in. So my role here is a bit varied. There's the work that I'm doing to support the climate school and to make sure that we have connections with policymakers and practitioners to help achieve impact out in the world. The work to also make sure that there's a real institutional commitment to using our own campus as a living laboratory for climate action and sustainability. And so helping to advise on the pathways in which the university is delivering on its own long-term plan, Plan 2030, which is helping to electrify the campus and decarbonize our operations. And so there's a lot of interesting work here. And the students are really engaged and, of course, pushing us to do more and faster, which is just a natural place where the world is right now.
Well, you have the best and brightest students there. As you pointed out, the researchers and the practitioners, the societal impacts and health impacts, obviously, of climate change. Then there's the business and the science engineering end. Do you see those conversations spreading across the different disciplines and schools?
Honestly, I think it's all happening. And whether you're at the business school, the law school, the school of public health, and up at the medical center, climate school is able to play a connector role to continue to provide that basic level of climate science into all these conversations and support the collaboration as well. It is really a remarkable place. And I think there's a lot of universities that are trying to figure out how to structure these sort of programs. Columbia has hit on a good model here for making sure that anybody that leaves Columbia with a degree has got the right level of climate education that's going to help them be successful in their career and make the world a better place.
So anything that stands out in terms of, okay, this is a notable success that we can build upon, anything that is particularly sticky in terms of a challenge?
The things that are happening here on campus around our own electrification and decarbonization, everyone's trying to figure out what their pathway is to decarbonization, to net zero. And we're doing that on a particularly old and historic campus. And so there's a lot of really interesting questions that are coming up around central energy plants and how that could be decarbonized. And we've got commitments to build new buildings that are now fully electric and not using fossil fuels. So there's good things that are in the pipeline and a lot of really interesting questions that are also providing good research and educational opportunities as the university itself is pursuing them. It's really interesting. But like so many institutions in New York City, the term that comes up in every conversation is Local Law 97. Local Law 97 being New York City's building decarbonization law that passed in 2019. It is focusing every real estate owner's mind as the most cost-effective way to achieve decarbonization in the near term as well as over the long term, and really plan out those capital replacement cycles and refinancing cycles. And Columbia University is no different in that regard. That is a really important component to the conversation that we are also navigating at the same time. And it's really just creating a lot of good and focused conversations around budgets and around strategy in order to deliver on the needs that have been set, both with our own targets as well as the sort of new regulatory environment that we all find ourselves in.
If you can take us a little bit through the timeline of how we got to Local Law 97, which tries, as you said, to tackle specifically the building sector in New York City, which is so important as we think about decarbonization.
Even some broader context here. New Yorkers have so much to be proud of for the progress that has been made, and that is across a lot of different areas. We're $20 billion in climate adaptation investments that we made after Hurricane Sandy, and that was everything from flood protection to whether it's upgrades to the electric grid or brand new elevated hospitals in our coastal communities, and the list goes on. There's just so much that has made the city safer since that moment, but also things like groundbreaking environmental justice legislation, the contracts to bring new clean energy transmission, which we should cover into New York City, the Champlain Hudson Power Express and the Clean Path New York project. And then, of course, what gets referred to as the gas ban, the all electric buildings commitments that now have just come into effect on January 1. But at the center of all of that, there's a connective tissue that Local Law 97 is really a centerpiece of so much of that. And there's a few facts that sort of back that up. One of we need to stop burning fossil fuels if we are to limit the worst global impacts from climate change that we see. And so we clearly need to transition away from those fossil fuels. It's using less energy, much more energy efficient use of energy, but also to do it in a way that is cleaner and electrifying our buildings, for instance, and making sure that those buildings are plugging into a cleaner grid. And so Local Law 97 covers a lot of those areas. Buildings account for about 70% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions and carbon pollution. And most of the buildings that are here today are still going to be here in 2050. And so upgrading new construction codes and building codes, it's important, but it will never get at the major part of the problem. And so early in the de Blasio administration, there was a clear focus on tackling this major component of the city's greenhouse gas emissions and started conversations with the council, with the real estate industry, that over the course of a couple of years led to the passage of Local Law 97, which sets declining caps for carbon pollution, for greenhouse gas emissions. We are now in the first compliance period, so 2024 is the first period, and every 5 years after this, there'll be declining caps on the emissions that buildings can put into the atmosphere in line with the Paris Agreement commitments. And what we're already seeing is that it's working. When the bill passed, we estimated that maybe 80% of buildings would not be in compliance during the first compliance period in 2024. Well, based on 2022 data, something like 89% of buildings are already in compliance. And so even 2 years in front of the deadline, we see a much higher percentage of buildings that are in compliance. And we only expect that number to go up. And so the law is working. But not only that, I think the much more exciting thing about Local Law 97 is how it has catalyzed this marketplace in New York City around clean energy technology, innovation, and investment that is all now centered in New York City. And there's just so many companies out there that are pitching products and starting companies and working to provide solutions to help building owners comply with this law. And that is having an economic development benefit here as well in New York City, because it's creating this energy and this mass of companies and smart people that are all trying to solve really big problems, but they're doing it here in New York City. And that's going to have benefits to be able to export that knowledge to other cities, to other parts of the globe that are all grappling with this. There's so much good that has come out of Local 97 at this point. But the path to get here, of course, was not easy. And there continues to be opposition, of course, to different parts of the law. But if the city is going to be able to tackle its carbon pollution in an effective way, existing buildings need to be at the center of that. And Local 97 has, I think, perfectly attacked exactly that problem, so that we can decarbonize those buildings and secure the jobs and economic development benefit that comes from that here in the city.
Obviously, all of this is an incredible challenge. And you mentioned some of the opposition to Local Law 97 along its path and some that still exist. When we get to the topic of some of the real world and current contemporary challenges of meeting the decarbonization goals, making progress, and then also the NYISO being in the business of balancing reliability. You're a member of our Environmental Advisory Committee, which you play a significant role in helping us plan for and understand what we can do better in terms of improving our strategic planning. We, as you know, pointed out that we've discovered a reliability violation in New York City beginning in the summer of 2025. Champlain Hudson, you mentioned, being a critical solution to that when it does electrify in 2026. When the subject of balancing all of these important aspects of meeting the climate goals come up, in your role, both on the EAC and then through Columbia with your background, how do you respond?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. I do commend the NYISO for its forward-thinking approach to this and really being a leader among ISOs in the United States for putting these core issues of clean energy, affordable energy, and reliability sort of as your North Stars for what we're trying to achieve here in New York City. And I think that of course, feels like the right way to frame the problem and how we get there. But of course, what looks like the bumps and bruises on the way to that clean, affordable, reliable energy system are going to be with us for quite some time. And I think the thing that stands out to me is that the transition from the summer peaking system to the winter peaking system that we're ultimately heading towards as we electrify heat and hot water, particularly in our buildings and in residential buildings. I was heartened by I think it was the Urban Green report that showed that we have about a decade of capacity before that becomes a real problem on the winter peaking side, which means we've got time to adapt and invest and make sure that we are not running into those reliability concerns. The ones that you point out about the peaker plants that may need to stay on longer. We need those big projects to come online to bring a cleaner grid forward. And whether Champlain Hudson is the first on that list that we need to see electrified and needs to stay on schedule, that's also true with Clean Path New York. And then we've been seeing a lot of challenges in the offshore wind space, which is the next set of big projects that would supply a lot of clean energy into both the city and the state. And that has me a little concerned because whether it's the global economic conditions and the supply chain challenges that have made those projects particularly difficult, and a lot of the NIMBY concerns that we've seen in the coastal communities, that's, of course, backed up by a lot of fossil fuel money that is helping to support that, it leads me to worry that there's a slowdown out there, and seeing the state cancel a few projects and then rebid them quickly. All of these projects need to move faster, and we need to overcome that opposition if we're going to be able to get to a clean energy system. The reliability concerns are clearly real, but I think another really important point here is that too many people, I think, assume that fossil fuels equals reliability. And we've seen plenty of cases where that hasn't been true either. And whether it was last year around Christmas time when we had disruptions, of course, the famous examples in Texas, where the system not being winterized had major impact. There's reliability problems sort of all over the place in our energy system, and we do need to have better answers to that. And I think a lot of it is in continuing to advance the projects we have, continuing to advance energy efficiency so that we're using the energy we have in a much better way and using a lot less of it for different purposes, and continuing to move these projects as fast as possible.
We point out that some of the reliability concerns we're seeing are kind of good news, bad news story, in that the policies are working. They're driving those inefficient units out of the system as they were intended. But we're not seeing the investment, as you point out, on the other side of the scale to balance out the loss. When you think about things that we can do as the wholesale bulk electric system operator responsible for reliability, but then also on the market side, incentivizing more innovation to address that unbalance that seems to be evolving as of late. Any thoughts from the market side that are helpful?
It's absolutely the right question, because this isn't just true in our electric system or electric grid, but so much of our infrastructure was built for a world and a climate that doesn't exist anymore. And certainly power being one of them. What I think is that the NYISO sits right at the crossroads of so many of these questions. And because it's taking a forward-thinking approach to this and isn't trying to fight off decarbonization or clean energy, that it puts the NYISO in a really positive role of being able to test out those different incentives and see what's helping move the market towards cleaner and reliable and affordable energy. But it comes down to the word that you said perfectly, which is incentives that both speed up the clean energy transition and continue to displace and crowd out fossil. The role that the NYISO plays to help provide that stimulus and incentive is really an important and not fully appreciated role, but it's a critical one that I think the state and other NYISOs, I think, are going to continue to learn from.
So from your vantage, you point out something that we talk about back here often, which is that the future state is probably a mix of resources and different technologies, wind, batteries, solar, and various other technologies that might now be in R&D or we have limited experience with, but someday may help us balance the system, provide flexibility, et cetera. From where you sit at Columbia, big research institution, but then also your roles working with parties outside of New York and federal side, any observations or interesting information that comes away in terms of those distributed emissions-free resources, or what we call DFRs, that you can share with us?
The first thing that pops into my mind, and maybe this is a topic for an entire different podcast, but like the role that the closure of Indian Point, for all the different feelings that people had about Indian Point, the region's nuclear plant, closing it had predictable outcomes that a lot of people did not want to really grapple with. We lost about 2,100 megawatts of carbon-free and quite cheap electricity that has yet to be backfilled with clean energy. And in fact, it drove the city's greenhouse gas emission, or the fossil fuel utilization, from about 67 or so percent of our electricity to over 90% being fossil based. And so that's a big hole that we're digging ourselves out of. And maybe then putting that aside for the rest of the conversation, I think what's happening around, as you call DFRs, that it is this distributed energy system that we're getting towards. And I think largely at this point, we know what those technologies look like, and the solar and wind and geothermal and storage and other things. And they're going to continue to get better. They're going to continue to get cheaper as they deploy. I think more technologies are going to go down that cost curve that solar has gone down. I think we're going to see that with batteries in particular over the next decade, that we need to be as flexible as we can on this with the technologies. And if new things come up, or if hydrogen becomes something that is much more real in the region, that is based off of a clean source of hydrogen, that we need to be as flexible as we can into integrating that into our energy system. I don't think we need to be dogmatic about this, but the things we need to be dogmatic about are making sure it actually is clean and not polluting and not deepening our dependence on methane or other fossil fuels. So I think we have a long road ahead of us. We're still at a place where renewables are only about I think, 5% of the grid. And clean energy sources are higher upstate than they are downstate. We have a lot of work to do to bring clean energy transmission into the city, whether it's from upstate in Canada or from offshore. I think a lot of pieces have been put in place to really bend the curve on our emissions here in the city and the state, but they are just coming into effect. And whether that's local law 97 or offshore wind or Champlain Hudson, there's a lot that's on the horizon and coming, and we needed to move a lot faster.
Obviously, the transportation sector is a big component of meeting the goals going forward. Talk to us a little bit about what your experience was like working for the mayor and thoughts on how the city's trying to address some of those transportation issues now. We're expecting the adoption of electric vehicles in and around the 5 boroughs to have an impact going forward, obviously on demand. So you feel like the city's doing what it can to try and tackle that sector as well, especially with congestion pricing being part of the debate of the day?
Unlike most other places in the country, buildings are our biggest source and transportation is second. The transportation sector is basically about a quarter of the city's carbon pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of that comes from private vehicles. So there would be a big mistake if what happens is we just take all the cars that have internal combustion engines and make all those cars electric. That might be a purely climate solution, but I think there's a big demand on the grid that comes from that. But there's also a livability component to that for a city like New York City, where we continue to need more sustainable and sort of micro-mobility options for getting around the city to do so in a safe way. And that leads you to a whole set of strategies around making sure that pedestrian safety is ensured all over the city, that we have safe and protected bike lanes across the city, that we are investing in speeding up our buses and building out more bus lanes and busways in New York City, and investing in the transit system, which of course is the primary goal of the congestion pricing proposal, is to raise money to invest in transit. It's our high density and our mass transit system that lead New York City to have 1/3 of the carbon emissions per capita as the rest of the country. And so we're already doing really good as a city in that regard on a per capita basis because of those. But we need to make sure that we're investing both in more housing and more higher density housing in New York City, as well as investing in our transit system and transit broadly defined, and whether that's the subway, but also buses and bikeways and pedestrian access and ferries and sort of all the different ways that we get around here in the region that can't just be overly reliant on cars, because whether congestion or just basic livability of our land use patterns, that's not really a place that's going to be successful for New York City. And so electric vehicles are definitely a part of the solution that we need here for those that need to rely on a car. But the other means of transportation are as important, if not more important, to a city like New York City.
I want to ask you about resiliency because you're poking at the subject here with the several references to housing and then the public transit system, livability in the city. Since Sandy, Con Edison's done and continues to do a lot to protect the infrastructure. But then there's the efforts of the city itself. Obviously, these are big projects to protect the transportation infrastructure and then also where and how people live. So is the city doing the right things there? What were some of the conversations that you were having before you left the administration? I know that there were several projects that were in various different stages of consideration.
Yeah, and this is really what takes it back to Hurricane Sandy being such a pivot point for New York City. We had an understanding, I almost think of it always as an academic understanding of the risks that we faced from climate change, but Sandy made it real vivid color in front of everybody's eyes, like we lived it. And what also changed after Hurricane Sandy was we actually had resources to do something about it. And whether it was the federal money that flowed from those post-Sandy appropriations from the federal government or the state investment or plenty of city investment, a whole bunch of projects spun up. And whether they were around protecting public housing and the public hospital system, our coastal communities, big projects like the East Side Coastal Resilience or the work that's coming from the Army Corps, literally over $20 billion of investment. But there was also an important transition away from just thinking about projects and like adding new projects to protect against particular risks and a new understanding of those risks, and to really bake resilience into what we do as a city. And that came into effect more in things like upgrades to the building code, upgrades to the zoning code, advocacy into Con Ed's rate setting process, and to make sure that the grid is looking at a wide array of risks and continuing to invest in them. And that played out in other infrastructure systems as well, the water and sewer network. So there was a real wholesale shift in thinking about these risks, not just from coastal storms either, but from sea level rise, from much more intense precipitation. I always find this data point really interesting on precipitation, that the record for intense precipitation had stood for decades, if not almost a century, and it was a little less than 2 inches an hour of rain at Central Park. And then Hurricane Henri in 2021 broke that record, and it was about 2 inches of rain per hour. And then 2 weeks later from Hurricane Ida, that record was shattered again by 50%, and we had almost 3 inches of rain an hour. And we saw the devastating impacts of that, and flooding in basements and subway, and the fatalities and the people who died in basement apartments in particular. It's just shocking. So it just reinforces the point that the risks we're facing, they're not just like new and linear. There's almost like a discontinuity in our climate system that is causing these much more intense events. And so, yes, we're facing coastal storms and sea level rise and precipitation and heat and all of these different things. And the city and many partners have been taking a really broad-based view of this to make sure that we are thinking hard about where we build, how we build, and protecting New Yorkers in coastal communities, but also inland, and looking at heat island effect in the city. There's just been so much work to think about all these risks and to invest in them and to reduce that risk. The real answer here is that we are at the beginning of a very long journey on continuing to adapt this city to a new climate, a new set of environmental factors. We're certainly already dealing with the sort of environmental and weather extremes that come from putting more energy into our atmosphere. We know that a warmer atmosphere holds more water, and so we're already seeing these much more intense rain events, but we're seeing heat waves and the worst coastal storms are getting even stronger. So like there's just a whole set of things that are happening. The investments in coastal protection and heat mitigation and cloudburst, all of that I think pays really big dividends for New Yorkers. But much like the decarbonization pathway, we need things to happen, and we need them to happen as fast as possible and faster than they're already happening to stay ahead of these changes.
Well, we agree, and your expertise on the Environmental Advisory Council has already been value added. I found your characterization earlier of the whole scope of the issue to be really smart and strong, that it's nonlinear, it's 3D, 360 perspective in terms of how we're going to address these challenges. This has been really interesting and helpful and informative. Dan, thanks very much for joining us today.
Great. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.